So I want to go back really briefly to this idea of measurement one more time. And there's a couple of reasons why I want to go back to it. One is because recently the doctor who's in charge of or one of the doctors who's in charge of the American response, the U.S. response, I think her name is Birx, Dr. Birx. She said in front of everyone that basically if you have coronavirus, if you have the virus and you die, they mark you down as having died from the coronavirus. So they count you as dying from the coronavirus. And that's very interesting, one way to measure deaths from coronavirus. Right? And then we have another case in Japan, happened recently. Someone went to the hospital because they had intestinal difficulty, an older person, and eventually they ended up dying. And after they had died, they marked them down as dying from the intestinal disease, and they also had coronavirus, right? And so here are two clear cases where one case they said the person didn't die from coronavirus, and the other case they're basically saying everyone who has it is dying from coronavirus. Now, it's really easy to measure the difference between someone who's alive and dead, generally speaking, right? I mean, yes, there might be some cases out there on the internet where someone, rose up from the dead. Everybody thought they were dead, but they're actually alive. And there are cases where, you're not really sure. For example, maybe they have no brain activity, but their heart and lungs are being kept alive with machines, right? And people talk about the fetus as well, and when a fetus is alive or dead. And so there are some ambiguous cases, but generally speaking, we know when someone is alive and we know when someone is dead. On the other hand, once we try to attribute cause, then we start to get into some really difficult situations, right? We try to find out why someone died, and we say whether they died from the coronavirus or they died from something else. Now, if you're 80 years old or 90 or even 70, you probably have some things that are not quite perfect with your body. I mean, even my age, I'm in my and I'm not actually perfectly healthy, right? So when someone dies at that age, maybe there are 3-4 things that could have gone wrong in their body. And a lot of times when people die of old age, they say of natural causes because, they don't really know exactly what the direct cause was. Now, in the medical field, from what I understand, they usually attribute death to the most immediate direct cause, right? And so things like dying from obesity, for example, is very difficult to say because people die from heart disease or diabetes. That's the immediate cause of the death, even though they might have obesity as a sort of underlying condition. So when we measure, though, if you measure something with a specific bias in terms of in a systematic bias, like Birx is doing, so they're constantly overestimating the number of dead in the United States. Now that's fine for the United States, but once you try to compare that data to another country that maybe is underestimating the number of deaths, like Japan, where they're counting people up, only in certain circumstances that they've died from the coronavirus, even if they've had underlying conditions, like they're labeling people as dying from pneumonia supposedly rather than coronavirus. We don't really know. So when you try to compare these two things, it's impossible, right? You don't know what the truth is. And so the bias is being pushed in one direction or another. And we don't know the magnitude of bias either, how far it's being pushed. One of the examples I often give in class is like with human rights, right? So generally NGOs try to make things look worse than it actually is because they want money, they want donations, right? And governments try to make things look a lot better than it is because they're saying, look, we're doing really great with human rights. We're not violating people's human rights. They don't want to be shamed into that. Now the truth is somewhere in the middle, but we don't really know where because both sides are pushing in opposite directions, and we don't know how far they're pushing. So we can't just average them because it's not necessarily directly in the middle of those two numbers, right? We don't know. And so once we have systematic bias, we don't really have a good way of figuring out the truth. Random bias is different. Random bias is actually just noise. Now, noise is not always a bad thing because if we have a little bit of noise and we still find a pattern, then we can say, well, the pattern must be really strong. The more noise we have and we find a pattern, we can say the pattern is very, very strong. If we have a weak pattern, though, and a lot of noise, then it's sometimes hard to determine the difference between the pattern and the noise. But with systematic bias, we don't really have any tools to deal with it, and so it's really important to have one kind of universal system for measuring deaths from coronavirus in order to compare different countries. Otherwise, we're going to have measurement problems and we won't really know what the true value of these things are or how to compare across countries.